Welcome to the Grid Podcast, episode 26. Our goal is to educate and to bring hard-hitting truths about America's critical infrastructure. I'm your host, Maria Sumnicht. A quick disclaimer, political opinions expressed in the podcast by participants are their opinions and not necessarily that of the Grid Podcast. Please subscribe, share, and like. It will help reach more people on this platform, and don't forget to turn the notification bell so you can be notified when we go live. Today, I welcome back our great guest, Dave Phelps, to the Grid Podcast. He recently published a white paper on preventing a grid down, a practical engineering approach. What a pleasure it is to have you on the podcast, back on the podcast today. Dave, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Maria. I'm delighted to be here.
Dave, a little bit about Dave. You couldn't tell from the accent, but Dave was born in England and immigrated to the U.S. back in 2008. And what a pleasure it is to now have him as a fellow American citizen. And he is a fellow of the London-based Institution of Mechanical Engineers. And this podcast is a follow-on from the podcast we did January 28th, 2026. Titled Preventing Grid Down, a Practical Engineering Approach. And now we have the white paper. And Dave, can you tell us a bit about what we're going to discuss today?
Yes, well, my primary push is towards establishing a real-world engineering-based grid hardening project. And so what I propose is to recap the key points from the last podcast called Preventing Grid Down, a Practical Engineering Approach. Same as my white paper. But this time, what I'd like to do is focus on the people aspects of a grid hardening project. Because no matter how good the project plan and organisation structure is, if the team players are not up to scratch, the project will fail. And conversely, the best team will fail in a substandard organisation. So I hope we can leave some reasonable time for questions and comments, and especially pushback, because this is...
Right. Yeah, we hit a couple really interesting topics last time. And, I was looking here at your paper and I read it, and it says, I like the part here says, part of the reason, why hasn't anything been done, right? And you actually tackled that. And in your paper, you said, part of the reason is that the government, industry, and advocacy groups have all been trapped in longstanding assumptions, institutional mindsets, cost and cost recovery. And, that is so true. And I think, just starting from that aspect of it, you want to tell us a little bit more how you address that in your paper?
Yes. The sort of logic behind the paper was my experience in industry. And I'm an engineer, and I spent my life in engineering, in the early stages, all conventional stuff in design and eventually project management and engineering management and that sort of thing. But it was in new product development that I learned to take a different approach. And these were big products. They were multi-million-dollar cryogenic plants, and others steam methane reformers and membrane plants and that sort of thing. And what I found was you have if you take the conventional approach, it's called value engineering or variations of it. It typically takes 5 to 10% out of the product in terms of cost or improves its power or whatever the objective is. But what I was looking for was to take 20%, 30%, even more, and it took a different approach. And that same approach, I saw the need in the grid down to solve the grid down problem. And as I look into other endeavours, as wide-ranging as the Manhattan Project, the 1940s famous Manhattan Project, and the equally famous Lockheed Skunk Works, and the more recent Midnight Hammer, you see all the same characteristics for a truly challenging project handled efficiently and effectively. And so that's what I put into the paper. So it's based on my experience in new product development, and it was over a fairly long period. So it wasn't I got lucky on one project. It was I gained a fair amount of experience on it, and I just see the need within the grid down community.
So, Dave, in the chat, they're saying that, they're saying that's better. Um, they're saying that your mic, I did some changes over here on my end, but it looks like, can you just say testing 1, 2, 3, and everybody in the chat, give me a number one. Put number one in the chat if you're hearing. Are you hearing me? Okay, testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
And can you hear Dave? Are we good? Come on, chat. Give me some feedback. I think we're good. I think we're good. I'm not quite sure what that was all about, but there was an echo at the beginning with your mic. I think my mic was okay. Was getting feedback initially. Glenn, are we good? 1-1. Okay, good. All right, good.
Okay.
So sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure we
Yeah.
were okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So anyway, you might have to repeat what you just said because I'm not sure if it was muffled or echoed and it didn't go well. I love live streaming. You know, a lot of people goes, "You're pretty
Well,
gutsy live streaming," and I'm okay with it. You know, I just roll with the punches.
Yeah, it's based on my experience in industry, in new product development, in the Fortune 500 company on capital projects up to there were multi-million-dollar projects, up to close to $1 billion one product line. But I learned how you tackle these to get an exceptional improvement. And in business, it's normally an improved cost, but it may be an improved functionality or reduced power or something of that sort, but it usually comes to cost. And I see exact parallels with the grid hardening. It's not that we want to reduce the cost. We've got this big product and we need to improve it. We need to make it, we need to harden it. And I see the parallels. And I've been involved in the grid down community for over 10 years now. And I've talked to a lot of people, of course, read a lot of books and all that stuff. And I just see the what I felt in the early stages is the best way of tackling it. And as I say, you could use the great projects in history, the Manhattan Project, the Lockheed Skunk Works, Midnight Hammer, and you'll see the parallel methodology that I'm proposing. There's a lot of consistency there.
So you said the main focus of this white paper is the electrical power grid mainly, but also other critical infrastructures. And you know, I know all the listeners who are our listeners that listen every week. They know that the grid is number one, and everything else is dependent on that. So you know, if how can America take this paper and be better educated into all the aspects of the grid?
Well, I mean, the point you raise is very important. People will say, well, if you harden the grid perfectly and you don't harden anything else, that's of no practical value whatsoever. I know at one time people would say, well, let's just harden the grid and then we can repair everything else. No, that's totally impractical. And the grid requires certain infrastructures just to operate. I mean, if you think of water, communications, transport for coal, if it's coal delivered, water, and so that is an integral part of the electric grid. So that those portions have to be hardened. And there's not much point in just hardening those portions to keep the grid flowing if they're not available for other users. But the point is I think it's true to say the grid is the most difficult to harden. That's not to say the other infrastructures are not easy, and they all have their different characteristics. But I think by getting the grid underway, the grid hardening underway, that will then cascade into hardening these other structures, which will pick on the ideas that are laid out to harden the grid. And of course, those other infrastructure will feed information into hardening the grid. And so it's not, you can't harden the grid in isolation. It has to be looked at as a project, but you have to be careful not to try to harden not to do too much in one time. You know, it's
right. So the you said the paper has three main objectives. Um, I'd like for you to discuss each one of those. So, to summarize the threats, the persistent lack of progress, which I think is, very important. Most people know at least what some of the threats are, but then, your solutions, the practical engineering based path forward, which is the important part because there's a
Yes,
lot of cooks in the kitchen right now, and many paths forward. But this white paper is excellent and probably the most solid uh, path forward that I've seen. So I'd
yes. Well,
really like for you to
thank
talk
you,
about it.
Maria. Yes, I mean, in the paper, I explain fairly briefly what the threats are and what the consequences would be. And that's only there because it would seem incomplete without mentioning those things, although theoretically they don't need to be there because there's tons of information on the threats and the consequences and all that stuff, stuff to make your hair curl, even mine. And I do spend some time on proposed reasons for no progress, and that's probably a controversial part of the paper. It's my only concession to diversity, in as much as I probably offend everybody equally, including myself.
Yeah,
If that But I think it's important. We need to recognise that there are reasons why nothing moves forwards, and well, by me, I'm pointing my finger at myself as well. I have to take some of the blame for no progress,
yeah,
virtually no progress, and I cover
that's
that. And we can
that's
talk about that today if you want. Yes,
yeah,
uh,
yeah. Let's touch upon that because there's been several people starting, with Peter Pry, at least 2 decades ago, that has been talking about this, and maybe even before that. But still, we're exactly the same place we were 2 decades
mhm.
ago. Why is that?
um, well,
What?
if
A
I'll
million
tell
dollar
you,
question.
let me just glance at my paper, and I'll take it down, and then we'll look at the some of the psychological issues. I mean, there are things like that people have heard of, normalcy bias, but they may not have heard of displacement theory, and they may not have heard of educated incapacity. And we can look at those. But yes, just looking at it, it's section 1.5 in my book, and part of the reason is that the grid has been built over a long period, over 100 years, and it's layer on layer, and it's old, it's complex. I mean, I sometimes think of it as like a stack of stick game, and you just pull out the wrong sticks and the whole thing falls down. But it's become the normalcy bias sets in. It works, and so for whether it's the people within the grid or the users, okay, there are problems, but it works. So we've got other problems, and there has been a tendency within the grid down community to underestimate the complexity of a project, and that's been serious. And some of the early, even you hear today, but some of the early commentators, senior commentators, would say things like it's relatively trivial technically, relatively trivial. Let that sink in. And it's a political problem, and it's the cost is it's the cost is insignificant. It's just politics, and even I've seen some good publication. I don't get into too much detail. I've seen some good publication where people say we know exactly what to do. There's no reason why we can't harden the grid, and it's just politics. We don't know exactly what to do because if you look at from respected commentators, you can see estimates, so-called estimates, to harden the grid from 2 billion with a B to a trillion plus with a T, and that screams out that there is no consensus on what it takes to harden the grid. Um, so that's been part of the problem, and so we talked about normalcy bias, and I said there's no consensus on the size of the project, and of course you can't. People try to put a cost to it, but you can't cost it. You can't or put a schedule to anything until you've defined it. It's project management 101, but people will confidently put costs on the table without a hint of the scope of what it would involve. Now, the various acts like the Grid Act and the Shield Act, and even President Trump's EO 13865, they all essentially, they're very well written. You have to study them and all that stuff. But what they essentially say, they refer to a number of government departments, usually coordinated by the DHS. What they're essentially saying is figure out the fix, then do it. I mean, you look at it, that's what it boils down to. There is no hint of what they do. And I mean, even President Trump's, obviously, he did not write that EO. It was presented to him and he signed it. And I've got the great admiration for him for doing that. But it was a non-starter from the start. And so what else? So, I mean, there are various reasons. I mean, you could say, well, why are we trapped in this cycle to nowhere? Because what happens is, at the moment, basically the only plan is to write an executive order or a bill,
Mm-hmm.
and then nothing happens, and then we complain, then we repeat the cycle. Incidentally, there is a bill being written by one of the grid down organisations. I'm not going to talk about that at the moment, but that is taking a different approach, so I'm not including that in my comments here. But most of the executive orders that are dedicated to hardening the grid, I haven't got a ghost of a chance of working. And again, in the paper, I talk about which department should handle the grid the grid hardening, and I look at all of it. I mean, the obvious ones are the DH, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, and the military, the Department of War. And my conclusion is, and I'm up to challenge, but it has been challenged, and people say, well, yeah, there's got some sense in that, is the Department of War. The reason being is that they've got the sort of command and discipline and leadership, and they've got a structure that can resist the lobbyists and the various interested parties from the Greens onwards. And so people get confused when I say that, because they immediately jump to say, well, what does the military know about electric, the electric power supply? What do they know about transformers? And well, the point is, they would manage the project. Manage is the wrong word. They would lead the project, but they would bring in experts from the grid. It has to be experts. You have to have experts from the grid, because people underestimate expertise. And expertise is much more than receiving training, a college training, and reading a few books. And so it's the sort of hands-on stuff that people have lived with for 20 years. We know people in the grid down community who've had 30 years in the industry. And you need that sort of experience. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin is experts in a room can often, you can sit there and they'll talk about it. It will be very impressive, and it will go around in circles, and depending on the particular group, sometimes you can have people pushing their own expertise. They don't want to be challenged. They'll bristle if somebody challenges what they say, and it goes nowhere. And a great example of that is in standards writing. And one of our people, in fact, on your podcast, there's a lot of gems on your podcast, talked about standards writing. And I talked to him afterwards, and he said he can take up to 15 years to write a standard.
Exactly.
And part of the reason is because you've got people there who, first of all, they'll make a career of it. They will, they'll pontificate. They want to show their expertise. They don't want to be challenged. Everybody has their own interests, whether it's the corporate interest or the personal interest, and it goes nowhere. And I said, in the program that I'm suggesting, the leader, when looking for people to contribute to this, will say, we need a standard written, as far as possible, use existing, we need a standard written. You haven't got 15 years, you've got 3 months. And
Right.
you'll be waiting for somebody to say, that's impractical. And that leader will say, you're right, it is impractical. 2 months. And if you're not up to the challenge, then please leave. We want people in. Now, Will they achieve 2 months? Maybe they'll have 100% overrun and it'll be 4 months. But that's different from chopping 10% out of 15 years. And that's the type of mentality that it will take. That's what this leadership, that's what this special task force will
Hmm.
be engaged in.
No, I agree. There's Randy in the chat says the DoD and DOW has several bases that are grid hardened and energy self-supporting in case of an attack. So it might be a good example to look into. You want to address that because there's most of the bases actually are not hardened, and I know you know more than I do about that, but if you could talk to that.
Yes. Yes, I'll be pleased to. And yes, as you rightly say, most of the bases or the information that we have, I have to be very careful because the information that's available in the non-classified arena, but the information we have is 97%, even 99% of the military facilities rely on the electric grid, so they're not hardened. Um, but yes, certainly the key military facilities are hardened. And this is another reason for me proposing that the military, the people are leading, because they've got more hands-on experience and expertise in hardening than pretty well anywhere else. And I mean, they wrote the standard, or they oversaw the standard. Obviously, they bring people in from the grid community, from the civilian community, but they oversaw that standard. The mill standard is it's used in both the military and the civilian area. So they have that expertise. The other thing that they have, of course, is access to classified documentation because a lot of what they do is classified.
Right.
But so I do think I think there's a strong case for hardening military sites first, and they have to be careful. You have to be careful how you select them. And Jonathan Holloman did an excellent piece on this, which I've included in the paper with his permission, and about selecting the right military sites, because you don't want a military site that's adjacent to a major conurbation where they would be overwhelmed and attacked. It has to be military sites that are fairly remote. Obviously, there'll be a lot of civilian people there because there's a bigger support need. But yes, there's a lot to be said for hardening a military base first. The other thing is there's a lot of interest in establishing small modular reactors,
Hmm.
and which I support. But I'm very cautious. People can get over exuberant and think, well, let's put small modular reactors in. I mean, I've heard plans to strip out all the generators and stick small modular reactors in. No, but we need to prove them first. They need to prove. But you've got much more chance of putting an SMR onto a military site with their rules than you have putting it on a civilian site with the NRC rules.
Right.
And so again, there's a case to put some nuclear reactor, of different technologies, some pressurized water reactors and some molten salt reactors, and perhaps even advanced gas cooled reactors. We were talking about that on Tuesday, on Monday. I'm sorry, with Trisco fuel, and so there's a lot to be said for the military to take the lead on this. But I hasten again, not for them to go off into their corner, solve the problem, then toss the solution over the fence into the grid arena and expect
Hmm.
them to follow it. That's not the way it will work. You've got to have buy-in, but you have to have their expertise. Nobody has expertise for the grid other than the engineers that have got experience in the grid,
No,
worked it.
I agree, because here in your paper, you say, I really like what you said here, that it's a marvelous engineering feat, our grid, and people don't really realize how vast and complex. It's an interconnected machine that has been
Yes,
slowly, since like the late 1800s, correct? Was the initial rollout of it.
yes,
And it's not like they rip and replace when something new comes, they just build on top of it.
yes,
So,
yes.
so there's a lot of legacy stuff uh, that is in there. And then to, I think, make it even more complex, what you have too is you have the large um, energy providers like Con Edison, PSG&E and PG&E, but then you have the smaller co-ops. And together, I think there's over 3,000 energy providers in the
Hmm.
United States. So there's a huge problem as well. Is how do you, it's like corralling cats. How do you get 3,000 individually run their businesses, right? Some of them are publicly
Yes.
traded to do the right thing.
I mean, that's an extremely important point, and yes, most of them are privately owned. I mean, there are some public-private operations, but yes, and it is highly fragmented. Um, but that's why, in my proposal, the key part of the proposal is the development phase. There are two phases: the development phase and the execution phase. And the development phase is the absolute key make or break. That's where this special task force that I talk about examines the various proposals around, including the strategy that you take on to harden the grid. You know, are you going to break into fractals? Are you going to replace it with DC instead of AC? Are you going to start ground up? Are you going to put islands in? You know, to decide the way forwards based on objective, solid information, to take the hardening procedures and products, evaluate them, and to come up with a solid plan. I call it the battle plan in my paper. And now to do that, they need a support team because they can't do all those evaluations themselves. So they need a support team, which would be drawn from, that would include the military. If it was outside of the military, it would include the military. It would include the grid. It would include the vendors. Um, and people from the grid down community. So you've got all that expertise with a liaison team to work with them. Now that team would not be paid for by this project. They would have their day jobs, but the special task force through their liaison team would have first call on their services. And because I'd have a champion, and I make a big deal of having a champion for this project, because that champion is there, these people are going to perform. If there's not a strong champion, they're going to be tardy. They've got their other jobs. Why am I going to bother with this? But if you've got a champion like Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Wright, and you could have President Trump as well. You know, they wouldn't do much, but the very fact that they're there, if anybody is playing games, they do not want to incur the wrath of the champion. And so I've lost my train of thought a bit there on this special task. I would just say about the champion as well. It's a champion, not a czar. I know people, and in fact, in the early days, I used to use the term czar or champion as interchangeable. They're not interchangeable. A czar is a super manager, a super leader, a bit of an autocrat, probably. You know, he's going to drive this thing through. This needs a true champion who's got to embrace that team. He's going to support them. He's going to make sure they get what they want. He's going to fend off any attacks on them. It's a champion.
Right. I agree with that. I'm not I'm not too keen on the term czar, but general or something like that. So it's run more like a military. If it's going to be in the military, it's going to be
Yes.
run like a military campaign, and it almost has to be with the amount of complexity of the
Yes.
system. And
And getting back to where I sort of left off is yes, that team will define the project in 18 months. I'm suggesting that's a tight schedule, but and then when that battle plan is in place, that will be handed over to the execution team, and part of the preparing the battle plan is how it will be handled. Now, I think there's a very strong case that it will be the execution will be carried out by the grid people themselves, because they're the ones that have got the expertise for major maintenance and upgrades and mods and all that sort of thing. They've got their own people. They've got access to contractors, so it will make sense for them to implement the findings of the battle plan. Now, the important point is they'll have to be monitored, for want of a better word. Theoretically, when this battle plan is handed to the execution team, which will be a more conventional, it's likely to be a mega project, but it'll be handled by the individual companies within the grid, and they'll have a mandate to carry out the work that has been specified. But the special task force and the champion will remain as consultants with teeth, if you like, to make sure that they don't deviate from what has been established. Now, in some cases, it would be necessary because in engineering, as you go through things change. You find that some things don't work. You thought they were going to work, they don't work, and better ideas come up. But my experience in industry, the best estimates, guesses of true experts working in freedom, working together, they'll stand up to a lot of later detailed engineering. So, but that's the way it will be handled. It will be handled within the grid. There'll be methodologies for hardening the grid. Hopefully they're simple methodologies. To use Einstein's guidance, as simple as possible, but no simpler.
Yeah. Yep. Let's address a couple things on the grid, and then I'd like to move into the different approach. I know you've been talking about it, but I really like this section in the white paper and how you addressed it. But let's see. I think we've talked about this so much in our other podcasts, but adversaries inside the grid. We all know that many of our pieces and parts of the grid, transformers especially, are made in China, and we have at least, well, we have over 600 of them on our grid, so that's not a good thing. And Richard also says grid owners do not have economic incentive, which is true. They don't. The government hasn't given them an incentive to do anything. And therefore, they use the excuse of, we're not going to do anything because if we do, we're going to pass the costs on to our consumers, right? And so
Yes.
we're in the middle. It's like a quagmire. No one's going to do anything. And the way
Well,
I've seen them operate, even if they do get incentives, they still pass the cost on to the consumers.
well, and in fairness,
Yeah.
ultimately the taxpayer has to pay, however you structure the costing. So it has to be paid. I mean, the
Yeah.
thing is, the power grid people have to be held harmless for these costs. I mean, you can't expect one segment of the grid to start work and incur costs and push their costs up to their
Mhm.
customers and then become uncompetitive to their competitors. Um, that has to be part of the plan. They have to be held harmless for the costs. I mean, the work has to be managed like a decent project. Which again, I go into the book at some length. We've lost the project management skills in the private sector, which is another reason I say we should go to the military. But it has to be handled as a cost-effective project,
Mhm.
so that people are not making backhanders out of this money. But the grid, it has to be designed so they recover the money. Whether they recover it through increasing the cost of electricity uniformly, or
Mhm.
whether it's covered by appropriations from the government, or a combination of the two. It um, it has to be costed, and it will cost the consumer, and there needs to be a lot of marketing to explain why it's being done and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I mean,
And
um,
going back to the transformer question that was raised, that's a very good one, because there is one solution, capacitor-based blocking devices, that has received a lot of attention, and rightly so. I mean, I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but it's a very responsible company. I mean, I've known them in the 10 years I've been involved, and the people there are responsible engineers. They have a wide knowledge and that sort of stuff. But it goes back to the point I said, things are not as simple as they would seem. As you get into the deployment of this, it isn't quite as simple as just putting in these blocking devices. And part of the reason is, when you solve one problem, you can create another in terms
right.
of harmonics and things like that. But also there are alternative ways. Do you include resistance within the capacitors? Do you put more capacitors in the line, or is it just local to the station? Do you just harden the extra high voltage transformers, or do you need to? They're the most vulnerable, but do you need to come down into other transformers? Do you need to harden some of the transformers, protect them in the distribution system? So it becomes very complicated. You listen to the engineers talking, and it doesn't. We don't come to a conclusion. In this task force I'm talking about, they will come to a conclusion because that's their role. They have the liaison team, and they have access to all these people, experts that they need, and their skill will be to come to a conclusion. And as far as the 600 transformer, I don't know how many it is. I think it was getting towards 700. It's crazy, but again, people need rather than well, let's pull them out of service. It needs some clever thinking. It may be, and the right people need to look at it, is they will nullify the effects of that software, malignant software that's been put in there, to render it harmless. Or even better, they will configure it so that it sends misleading information back to its source.
Right.
And turn it into an asset for America. That needs clever thinking. That's not conventional thinking. That's the thinking of this special task force. And again, when I talk about the special task force, I do give the illustration. Don't think of a commission or a committee or even a series of workshops, where people come together. This is a team that works together for the 18 months. Think more SEAL team or Delta team, the way they work. And
Yeah.
I mean, they're committed to the result. They're committed to each other. There's a loyalty there. They have a different command structure, and they're misfits, but they're the right kind of misfit. And this team that I'm talking about will be misfits, but the right kind of misfit.
Right. Right.
I cover that in the book.
Yeah, yeah. And I was just so I'm going to scroll past that because you mentioned it, and you're right. So this team is a team of like a Delta Force team where they plan. It's planning, 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 and then
Yes.
execution, right?
Yes.
And so here in your white paper, you talk about the three fundamental phases of the project, and the development planning phase, and then the development phase, which you have different than the
Yes.
development planning phase, and then execution phase, which
Right.
go into that and talk about this approach.
Certainly, yes. Now, we've talked at some length about the development phase, which is the critical make or break phase. That's the point of where this special task force, this industrial equivalent of the Delta Force or the SEAL team, come up with the battle plan, which defines the hardening strategy, including how costs are recovered. So that's the key phase. The next phase we talked about a bit is the execution phase, which I will expect will be a more conventional phase. And it has to be carefully, the hardening has to be designed so that it can be retrofitted. Because you can talk about Faraday cages and things like that, but they're largely not practical for retrofitting. Yes, you can in the control rooms and substation control rooms and things, perhaps put panels, hardened Faraday cage panels in, but you really need bolt-on things, bolt-on ferrites and chokes to capture the for the super fast E1 to capture the E1 as it's rising, so that you can use a more conventional voltage suppressor, MOV, to clamp it and send it to Earth. Those sort of things, which are kind of bolt-on solutions. So that's the execution phase. But equally, well, not equally critical, but critical is the project planning phase. Now, I say that's a 6-month phase, and that needs a small team of people who are willing to push this. And some of them may become special task force members, or they may become support team members or liaison team members. But these people are going to launch it in 6 months. They will be involved in working with the government, the relevant government that's selected, to select the team, or to agree the methodology first, to select the team, to select the method, to produce the development plan, and then hand it over to the development team. So that's very critical to plan the development phase.
Yeah.
And there's a phase I don't mention before that, is the pre-planning phase. And what that ideally, it needs the requirement needs to get to government, and that's where the grid hardening community could do a sterling job, is to embrace the methodology that I'm talking, improve it, correct it, or throw it out for something better. But at the moment, there isn't anything better. That's a bold claim. But, we to embrace a realistic plan, and then to use our collective skills to get it to the right people. And in the overall grid down community, there are people that have excellent contacts within government, but they need to have a solid, realistic plan to put to them. And that's the phase, if you like, that's the pre-planning phase. So there's the development planning phase, the planning phase, the development phase, and the execution phase. But before that, there is this work that has to be done. And I mean, the grid down people are the obvious ones to do it because they've got an understanding of what's needed. They have an incentive. I mean, it's their our modus operandi, if you like.
Right, right. And an interesting aspect of the of the plan is you mentioned, a Delta Force team, so it would be a grid Delta team,
Yes,
and most experts of the caliber that you're going to need for this are going to want to get paid. So there's going to have to be a branch of the, if it's going to fall under the military, that instead of being called the Delta team, which we know is a combat team, the grid
yes,
Delta team, which is a combat team, but to deal with all the vulnerabilities and
yes,
threats against the grid. But it'll be, made up of civilians and also military, right? But how do
yes.
we get funding for that? What are the approaches for the funding mechanisms that we could address? Because it really all comes down to, so we don't have the money, although we can send billions, across the
Yes.
pond, right? I won't mention where, but we all know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, and I mean, I can say a bit about the some of the characteristics of the Delta Fund, but to come back to the cost, that's very important. The
Hmm.
important thing is it depends how if you look at uh, the pre-planning phase, I think that will be pro bono by people within the grid down community. But once you get to the development planning phase, that 6 month phase, those people need to be paid,
Hmm.
and it depends on who the people are, and where they stand within government. But they'll have to be paid. But if you look at the cost of 6 months' work for a few people, it could be 5 or 6 people. You're looking at less than $1 million.
Yeah.
And if you go to the development phase, which is the critical phase, I have to keep saying that because it is super critical. If you cost that out, I've looked at it a number of ways, and the costs are probably less than 15 million with a little m dollars. It's
Hmm.
peanuts. Now, the execution phase is going to be that's going to be expensive. Now, I don't want to jump numbers, but it's if people talk between 2 billion, less than 2 billion, and a trillion, if I was a gambling man, it's going to be closer to the high end than the low end. Now,
Right.
if somebody put a gun to my head, I would jump a number for it, but it's got to be in the hundreds of billions. I would expect, again, unless the military, from their experience with unclassified data, can come up with different categorizations of the threats and solutions that they've got, it may be a simpler problem. But at the moment, we have to regard that as a bonus, not the expectations we go into. We tackle this based on current knowledge of the threats and current knowledge of the mitigations. It's going to be expensive,
Hmm.
but I qualify it that way. But a Delta Force, I actually jotted down. In fact, I think it's in the book again. Just to let me just read you how a Delta Force operates.
Okay.
A Delta Force operation is a small, tightly integrated unit composed of highly selected and extensively trained operators. Each member is cross-trained across multiple specialties: assault, reconnaissance, communications, medical
Hmm.
support, uh, allowing the team to function with minimal external support. Now, this will we will need supporting what we're talking about. Command authority is decentralized, enabling rapid decision making under ambiguous and high risk conditions. The team is designed to deploy discreetly, adapt quickly, and accomplish missions where failure is not an acceptable outcome. They plan in detail, but this is important. They expect the plan to break, but when it does, they don't wait for permission. They solve the problem and move on. I could say a lot about that in
Mm-hmm.
in industry, how it operates,
Yeah.
and the reason I picked the Delta Force is because I'm honoured to know a man who actually a general who was a founder member of the Delta Force. He went on to command all special operations, and I like to hear his take on the military. And again, just to say in the military, I'm not starry-eyed about the military. I realise there are branches of the military, or that not branches of the military, but there are military men and military men, and people have a different concept of the military. Some, if they were driven out by the COVID nonsense, because they
Right.
wouldn't take that the toxic jab, they'll have a different view of the military and somebody else. All military people are not the same,
Right. Agreed.
and you've got some who are probably working in the cafeteria. You've got others who are planning and carrying out the operation to rescue the two airmen in Iran. They're not one and the same. And the same applies to engineers. There are engineers and engineers. You can have a structural engineer designing supports for storage tanks. You can have an engineer designing the Golden Gate Bridge. They're not equal, except
Right.
they both got the name. Both got the title engineer. So when I talk about military, I'm talking about this cutting edge end of the military, not the perhaps the more usual form of the military,
Yeah.
the more standard form of the military.
Yeah. So Richard mentions in the chat a couple interesting points, which so we know there was in 1965. We know there was a Northeast blackout, and then of course the 2003. And when I lived
Yes,
in New York City, there was another one in 2019 in
yes,
August. But that only dealt with the lower west side. But still, that's a huge, it impacted a lot. And still, no lessons learned. True.
yeah,
And he writes, these meetings have already been held, no traction in Congress or industry. All technology is available. That's true. There's a lot of solutions. And that's what
yes,
this podcast is all about, is inviting engineers, innovators, and other subject matter experts to say, we've got solutions, but the traction has been nil in our government and in the private industries that own sections of the grid, right? So
yes.
what can we do to to move the needle? Because that's the hard part. Hey, I've been
Well,
up on Capitol Hill, and I nothing, you know.
yes. Well, I agree. I mean, some of those that you mentioned. I mean, I think the 1989 blackout, which was a solar event, I think 55,000, sorry, 55 million were without power for several days. I mean,
Yep.
that was major, but there've been a number of them. But this is why I make such a fuss of this special task force, you know,
Yeah.
because if you just have any group of people and it's going nowhere. It's just having solutions is no good. It's a bit like saying the military. Well, how do you get those soldiers out, those airmen out? Well, we've got helicopters and we've got A-10s have we, and we've got ground forces, we've got the Marines, and we've got missiles, and we've got this, that, and the other. So we've got everything we need. But it's of no use until it comes together in a plan. Because some of those things are useless for this particular application. You want the best solutions, combination solutions for that particular. I mean, it's totally different rescuing an airman in Iraq from driving the Russians out of Ukraine, for example.
Right.
Uh, and and that's what this team is for. That's what the special task force is to pick through those. And there's an example in the book in Appendix A. If in fact I think it's the first example I use. of developing a nitrogen, reducing the cost on a nitrogen generation system. And you'll see the innovations that we used there, and none of them were the teams. We simply took stuff that had been around for years, some over a decade,
Mhm.
ideas, great ideas, but it went nowhere because partly because no one had the authority to actually implement those because there's a risk with new technology. And but because I had a champion, I describe it in the paper. I had a good team, a team of misfits, and we took not just one of those ideas. We took about 10 of them. They're listed, and we took 45% out of the cost. Uh, but without that team and without the champion and without the methodology, they would have just remained as great ideas. You know,
Yeah.
why do we use structured packing in distillation columns? Why don't we just pour in ratchet rings? Well, that's a great idea, but you know, it's going to take the risk. Well, we had the authority and we took it. That's what we did. It was very successful.
Yeah. Well,
But that's the importance of this team.
yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned a word that is very important twice: authority. So
Yes,
you there there has to be some sort of executive order or an act of Congress, which we know these days I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, that they'll
yes,
actually all work together to do something. But to give that team authority,
yes.
just to go in and get the job done. And it, without that, it's going to be really difficult to herd these cats to get them to do anything. Um, that's why we are where we are today. Um, and uh, it's really frustrating, having worked on this for the last 4 years, just
Yes.
just seeing nothing, move and having high level meetings, but yet nothing comes of it. So, I, what, what do you think we can do beyond what we're doing?
Well, as I say, I think if the people that feel interested and are willing to tackle the project as opposed
Mhm.
to other things, there's lots of good things going on. You know, people are doing things, and that's all good stuff. But the people that are interested in a real world project to get something done, if they will look at my paper critically, really critically, and bring it into shape, as I say, or replace it with something better. But at the moment, there is nothing better. That's a bold claim, yeah, and I'll put that out as a challenge. If there's something better, let's have it, and I'll be interested.
Mhm.
Um, so that's the first thing to say. Yeah, we have a realistic plan, which we didn't have before. But there aren't any realistic plans. As I say, the plans at the moment are let's write an executive order for the DHS to figure out the fix and do it, and that's
Yep.
passed off as we put something in place. So that's the first thing is to agree this is a sound methodology, or we'll kick it into a sound methodology
Yeah.
and take that to government. It has to go to government, and suppose it's Peter Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth, and he will say, "Yeah, I accept this because I understand the rationale. You can make the case, you can explain how it works, and you've convinced me. Well, it's sound, so we'll pull the team together,
Hmm.
and uh, and once the team is in place with the freedom to operate with, as I say, Secretary Hegseth and Wright and maybe Donald Trump, and then it will work. As I say, I know this from experience because within a Fortune 500 company, the traditional way of doing things, improvements, new products, and things like that was value engineering, and there were various, big companies have these various initiatives, E squared, engineering excellence, and I kept a note of them, all the initiatives. But basically, if they took 10% out of an existing cost, or they replaced a product line with another product line, if it was 10% cheaper gas cost or cheaper capital cost, that was a good achievement. Uh, to to do something dramatically greater than that, like 45% out of the cost, took a special team with the freedom. It's the freedom under the champion to do what's necessary, and the ability to do it, and the commitment to do it is the way it will. It works in industry. I have to believe it will work for the grid.
Yeah, and I mean, I love this paper, and I like what you did with it, because what you did is you put up the dartboard, right?
Right.
You know, I'm going to put a link in the chat with Dave's email address. So for those in the chat, you know, grab that email address, write him a letter and an email, and he will send you the white paper,
Mm.
and you know, uh, help him with it. Throw darts at it. Let's make this
Yes.
something that we can take as a solid foundational plan to want our leaders, uh,
Yes.
Trump or someone, to do something, or as Richard says, a group has given up on the government and have just created a private sector project. And you know, same thing. It's interesting, because if you set this up right as a private sector project, you can actually apply for grants. There's a lot of grant programs out there that are centered around security, especially in urban areas, and suburban, as well as rural. And you can actually apply for these grants and use that money to do things. And it would be interesting. And I know it's starting small, but you could probably get more traction with some of the co-ops, you know, because they're actually owned by the people who, by their customers.
Yes. I mean, I'm in a co-op. Yeah,
Yeah,
I get my
exactly.
electricity from a co-op,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
but
So,
but the thing is, Maria, is I mean, there's tons and tons of these initiatives,
yeah,
and we could name them, but I've never seen one get any real traction.
yeah,
And which is why there are two things I think it needs to be done from the top, and not government, which is why I'm saying the military. You could say, well, the military is a branch of government, but I think it's a different branch of government. But two things: this is a national problem, and it needs a national solution. And treating it as a local solution, it's well, I go into no, I don't go into the paper. I was going to go into it today, but it's displacement activity. I don't know whether people are familiar with displacement activity, but it's a phenomenon that's been discovered. Yeah, has been investigated. It's what animals do. You know, chickens, for example, if they're under attack, they'll suddenly start pecking the ground or preening the feathers. Um, that's not going to help the attack, but they don't know what to do. So they'll do, at least they're doing something. And my concern is, first of all, I think it's good to do anything. If we can do a local initiative, just put a reactor in somewhere, or it's good. But we have to be careful that we don't think, oh, well, that's it. We can't do anything big. We've done something. So that's it. That's displacement activity, as opposed to doing something to get the ball rolling and move forwards. But it's difficult to do anything small. Yeah, there's we could talk a long time on that, on the various initiatives that have been conducted over the last 10 or 15 years, and go into detail to see what's actually been accomplished. I'll leave it at that. Um, it's a national problem. It needs a national solution. And
yeah, and it is a national problem. It actually is an international problem, because our woes
yes,
are
yes, it is.
everybody else's woes too. We're not the only one. Everyone else is in exactly the same position
Yeah.
as we are in, and ours might be more vast, across a greater land span. Uh,
Mm.
Russia and China would be the only ones, but yet they don't. There's huge parts of those countries that have absolutely no power. Uh, so compared to America, which we have it, you know, north, south, east to west, and all the way, you know, in between. So I did put your. I want to make sure people can see that. I did put your email address into the chat. Uh, so Richard, you said please provide his paper to everyone. Dave wants to distribute his paper and wants to know who he's sending it to. So what I did was I put his email address, which is Dave at his last name, Phelps.net. So Dave at PHELPS.net.
Yeah,
So you can send him an email and request the white paper, and that
yeah.
way, because he wants to collaborate with other experts in making the paper better. So it's his form of QA
And
and control, document control.
there is a paper version of it. That's what it looks like. It looks like a book
Yeah.
because originally it was going to be a book, and it was really right at the last minute that I changed it to be a paper for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was so that it can be easily updated, because it's not like a research piece or an information
Mhm.
piece, it's a working blueprint. And so I want to be able to receive information and update it. A book gets out of date very quickly if it's a working book. So that's why it's a white. It reads like a book because it was intended to be a book originally.
Yeah, and we've barely even touched upon all the content in it. But what I wanted to do is get it out there, get people to see and know and reach out to Dave and help him in this effort. So I want to thank Dave for writing this paper. It was quite an endeavor, and I enjoyed putting in my 2 cents in the cybersecurity section of the
Yes,
paper.
much
So,
appreciated.
I truly think what a gift it is that you undertook this, and as from what I've seen, it's the most comprehensive, practical approach to addressing that I've seen that actually addresses every aspect of it. It's of course we're sort of boiling the ocean, but you brought it enough pieces together that this can actually be taken even further in that delta team, right? And
Right.
so I thank you for that, Dave. I thank you very much. And if anyone has additional questions for Dave, I did, like I said, I did place his email. Dave, is there other ways they can contact you?
Well, if they probably email is the best way to contact me. I am on LinkedIn, but email is the best way, and I'll respond very quickly.
Okay,
And I mean, people can text me if they want. I can give my telephone number if that helps. My mobile number.
great. So a big thanks to our guest, Dave, for joining us today. Do you want to close us out with some words of wisdom and in this pursuit that we're in putting our selves foot forward to try to solve our grid our
Well,
grid
I
issue.
just Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity, Maria. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the questions of the listeners, which are so valuable in flushing out issues. I need to think about some of these things. But as far as wisdom, I think please look at the paper. I can send you a two-page executive summary. Look at it objectively,
Hmm.
and let's move forwards, because we're going nowhere at the moment. We're spending lots of time. Having lots of talks. We're making movies. We're writing books and op-eds and all that stuff, but we're not going anywhere. So look at it objectively. Tear it to pieces. That was the basis of the project work I did in industry. Is the straw man approach. It's put out there to be torn to pieces, and that's the way you progress.
Yep. And someone mentioned in the chat, I'd have to go up a little bit to see it, but they said the most traction that they ever got on hardening the grid or doing anything about it was right after 9/11.
Right.
But then
Yes.
it quickly fell away. And we hope we don't have another 9/11 in order to get us
Yes.
to move on this. It would be a horrible thing because where we are now is actually more vulnerable than where we were back in 2001. So,
Yeah.
with that, a big thanks to our guest, Dave, for joining us today, and all our grid warriors who tune in weekly to support the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you next time on the Grid Podcast. Thank you, Dave.
Yes. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to the Grid Podcast Experience. This podcast was made possible by the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, a 501c3, and grid warriors around the nation. If you would like to support more content like this, please visit the Task Force website to donate. Your donations are tax deductible. A steadfast thank you to the following organizations dedicated to securing the American power grid against all hazards. Thank you to our grid warriors for their kind generosity and support. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and comment to stay connected with the Grid Podcast.